Sailing Ships and Sinking Spoons. Please note the authors. First published by Pratham Books, and I'm Kiwi Opa. Tenzin and Tashi were two young Tibetan monks. They lived in a small monastery on a beautiful green hill. Here it was lovely when it rained. When Tashi looked out of the window late one morning, the rain was coming down hard. Rivulets were forming where the water had made paths on the muddy road. Tashi couldn't think of a better way to spend the afternoon than sailing paper boats. Tashi and Tenzin set about making many paper boats. As soon as it stopped raining, the boys ran outside. They sailed the paper boats they had made, some big, some small. The boats floated nicely along the path. The two young monks were happy. As they trotted back home, they saw Jen Lobsang. Now, Jenla, a polite way of addressing the teacher in Tibetan, lived in the monastery and told the children the most wonderful stories. Jenla, shouted Tenzin, can you tell us a story about why boats float? Jen Lobsang thought for a minute and said, I don't know why boats, or ships for that matter, float, but I am curious to find out. Jenla and the children decided to go and ask Miss Sonham, the science teacher, if she knew why boats float. Tenzin and Tashi gently pulled Jen Lobsang from his chair. They held his hands to help him walk. When they reached her room, Miss Sonham was reading a book. Tashi Delek, said Jenla, Tashi and Tenzin. Tashi Delek, she replied. And just so you know, Tashi Delek is a common Tibetan greeting. Tashi means good fortune, and Delek means well-being. We have a question for you, said Jenla. Yes. Can you tell us what makes boats float on water, miss? Tenzin asked. I can, said Miss Sonham. Or maybe we can find out together. Before they knew it, Miss Sonham was giving instructions. Tenzin, please bring a plastic basin from the kitchen. Tashi, please fetch a small bucket of water. Jenla, hold this apple. Now, please, don't eat it. Miss Sonham asked Tashi to fill the tub to the brim. Now, Jenla, she said, dip the apple in the tub, please, enough to cover it completely in water. Jenla gently dropped the fruit into the tub and pushed it down with his little finger. Some water spilled. Tashi and Tenzin shrieked, the water is overflowing. Jenla let go of the apple and it rose up. Miss Sonham was smiling. What happened here? She asked. Jenla pushed the apple into the water, said Tenzin. Water spilled, said Tashi. The apple's floating, said Jenla. Correct answers, all of you, said Miss Sonham. Now, can you tell me how much water spilled, Tenzin? Was it about half a cup or 1 cup? Tenzin looked at the water on the table and on the floor. He said, "Maybe 1 cup." "That sounds right," said Miss Sonam. Jenla and Tashi nodded in agreement. "Now, take the apple out. Tashi, fill the tub again. Here, Tenzin, will you drop the spoon into the water?" Tenzin did so. The spoon sank to the bottom. "Too heavy," said Jenla. "Not as heavy as a ship in the sea," said Tenzin. "Very little water spilt this time, not even 1/4 of a cup," said Tashi, a little sad. "Again, you're all correct," said Miss Sonam. Then she asked, "Do you see, after Jenla dropped the apple into the water, the apple pushed some water away before it could float?" "Is that the water that spilled?" asked Tenzin. "Yes. So the apple could float because it pushed away more water than its own weight. That means the apple is lighter than the water it pushed away." "But what about the spoon then?" Jenla said. "Well, the spoon also pushed some water away, but much less. Certainly less than its own weight. So it sank." "But what about large ships in the sea, on which there are many people?" asked Tenzin. "And many spoons that sink," added Tashi. "The spoons won't make a ship sink, Tashi. The ship is big enough to push away a lot of water. Again, like the apple, more water than its own weight. You don't notice it because in the ocean there is so much water. The ship is still lighter than the amount of water that it pushes away." They were all quiet for a bit. "I think I understand," said Tenzin slowly. "Can we sail some boats now?" asked Tashi. "It's time for my tea," said Jenla. Miss Sonam smiled. "Yes, enjoy yourselves," she said, and gave the boys colour paper to make boats with. Tenzin and Tashi made more colourful boats and set them down in the water. They watched the blue and yellow boats, the red and green boats, and white boats sailing like prayer flags floating in the stream. "I don't see any water spilling now," said Tashi. "No, silly," laughed Tenzin. "The water doesn't always spill. It just gets pushed away." "I think the boats just make some space for themselves in the stream," said Jenla. "So what is gravity? What would happen if Tenzin dropped a football from the top of a tree? Would it fall to the ground? Or would it rise up towards the sky like a balloon?" "That's right. It would fall because of a force called gravity. Did you know that everything gets pulled towards the earth by that force?" "What is buoyancy? What would happen if Tashi dropped a football into a bucket of water? Would gravity pull the football to the bottom of the bucket? Or would it float?" Yes, but in water there is an upward force that opposes gravity. It is called buoyancy. As gravity tries to pull the football down, buoyancy tries to push it up. In the case of the football, buoyancy is stronger than gravity, so it floats. What would happen if he drops a brick into the bucket? And why? Now, what is displacement? When you drop an object into water, it tries to make space for itself by pushing some water aside. In other words, the object displaces water to make space for itself. Bigger objects, like a basketball, displace more water than smaller ones, like a cricket ball or a spoon. A long time ago, a Greek scientist named Archimedes, he discovered that when the weight of the water displaced by an object is more than the weight of the object, it floats. That is why apples float in water. Can you guess why other objects sink? And finally, what is density? Now, every object around us is made of tiny particles that can't be seen with the naked eye. Density is how closely these particles are packed in an object. The weight of Tashi's small glass marble may be the same as Miss Sonam's apple. But why is the apple bigger? Because there is more space between the particles in the apple. In the marble, the particles are much closer to each other. An apple is less dense than a marble. Generally, dense objects sink in water. Now here's a game you can play with your friends. Pick 4 or 5 objects. Guess which ones will float and which ones will sink. Then drop them into a bucket or a tub of water to check. Have fun!